Hello, Brett Gallant, SierraWest Scale Models, and in this video we are going to look at simple to apply chipped paint effects on my 3D printed detail parts. We're going to use rubbing alcohol and a cosmetic wedge sponge. Our test subject will be the very ambiguous O-scale 55-gallon oil drum. So the very first thing you want to do, this is what it looks like when you get it from me, is we're going to put a hole in the bottom of it so we can anchor something to it that'll make it easier while we're painting and weathering it. And you can use a hand drill or a Dremel, whatever, makes no difference. Once you've got your hole added to the bottom of your castings, you're going to want to take a scrap of wood. Here's a scrap of a paint stick that I've applied some double stick tape to, and you're going to place your unpainted castings on the stick. Use a quality flat black spray paint. You can use a flat red or a flat khaki. I like black. You'll see why in a few minutes. And once that paint has cured for a couple days, this is what we end up with. We got our 3D printed 55-gallon oil drum. We have a hole in the bottom of it to mount a stick to, and it's been painted flat black, and that base paint has cured. This is just a scrap of wood with a brass wire inserted in it. You don't have to have anything like this if you don't want to spend the time to do something like this. You can use a simple rounded toothpick, insert it into the hole. A little drop of super glue will help hold it in place while you're working on it. But this is the foundation for everything that comes next. All right, now that we've got several oil drums to work with here that are all mounted the way we've described, I'm going to treat each one of these a little differently, but let's start with the most basic, and that would just be a simple solid color. This is a buff colored paint from Vallejo Miniatures. There's a lot of different great brands on the market. Don't get hung up on brand. For something as simple as this, we're just going to use a soft rounded brush. And I generally, with my oil drums, will start at the top and work my way down. As we get into a little bit more advanced techniques with multiple color combinations on the single oil drum, we'll use a different brush like the chisel off to the side. But for right now, just going to put a layer of this water-based paint over the ribbed oil drum 3D printed part. Keep it nice and smooth. We want to try to minimize and eliminate as many brush strokes as possible. And I mean, it really doesn't get much simpler than that. But now here comes the cool part. This is the whole point while you're watching the video. So we're going to take it and just submerge it in a small jar of isopropyl alcohol for a moment. We don't need long. And then we're going to use these simple cosmetic wedge makeup sponges that you can find at basically any store that sells cosmetics. And we're just going to slowly and carefully and lightly dab it onto the surface of the isopropyl saturated water-based paint. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull up the paint in a random pattern. We want to be very careful not to create geometric shapes, and we're going to expose the black spray paint base that we created underneath it. So that's step one. All right, so let's move on and do a couple more variations of the technique. Same technique, we're just going to use different colors, different brushes, in different colorways. So in this particular instance here, we're going to do the top of the oil drum one color, in this case a off-white. Then we'll do the body a second color. But before we do that, it's always important when you are going to peel the paint with the brush. Sorry, if you're going to peel the paint with the sponge, you want to make sure that the part that you're peeling is wet. It's fresh right out of the bottle of rubbing alcohol. So we don't want to do multiple colors at one time. Generally, we want to do one color at a time, chip and peel it, and then come back and do a second color once that rubbing alcohol is dried. So here we've got another variation. We'll do the top one color. We'll do the middle band on the drum, the same color as the top. And you can see I've chosen a thin chiseled brush. The bristles are still flexible, so I can work my way through it. And this is really not, it looks like I'm being very precise. I'm not being that precise. I'm just applying enough pressure to the oil drum with the brush hand that the bristles spread out to the right width of the band. And if you get a little bit of paint on the upper or lower band where you don't want it, It's going to be very easy to remove that. You can see once again I'm avoiding geometric patterns. That's real important. And here what I'm doing is I'm taking a dry brush with the wet oil drum, and I just made a very quick swipe to remove a little bit of excess paint off that top band where it didn't belong. And then now let's do the final colorway in this initial group. And in this particular instance, what we're going to do is I needed to grab some paint that wasn't on my table already, a little bit of green paint. You can see I have multiple brands of paint. Really doesn't matter what brand of paint you use. You'll find they all behave a little differently, so experiment a bit. Find out what you like best, works for you. I also get a lot of questions about just a simple little brush wash unit with a little bit of water in it. So I just cleaned the brush off super quick. So let's do a olive green, olive drab, army green, a lot of different names for the same color paint, top and the middle band, kind of similar to what we just did. And I think it, one other thing I wanted to mention is that green chunk that I keep on shoving the sticks into. That's just a piece of florist foam. I think I purchased that at Walmart. It'll be in the department where they sell fabric and sewing things. So that's a real convenient way to store parts while they are drying. Sorry about that. So back to the same process. A little bit of paint, submerge in the rubbing alcohol, slosh it around for just a moment, and then we take our cosmetic wedge sponge, and without creating geometric patterns, I keep on harping on that, without creating geometric patterns, we want to peel the paint away a bit. So that is the second layer level of detail. We're going to come back and do a third one in just a moment. We have waited a few hours, long enough time for the paint that we just applied to be thoroughly dry. And one of the really incredible aspects of this in super simple technique is being able to layer the paint. And so that's what we're going to do now is we put our base layer of buff off-white down. I don't use a lot of blue, but looks nice sometimes. So let's come in and apply a layer of blue on top and in the middle band of this ribbed oil drum. And this is going to become repetitive. It's the same technique that we've done using a brush of an appropriate size. These techniques work well in any scale. I specifically use O-scale castings because they're so easy to see, but you HO-scale guys out there, there's absolutely no reason that these techniques don't work perfect in HO-scale. So dunk it in the rubbing alcohol, slosh it around, and then of course take our wedge sponge, cosmetic sponge, and remove the paint. And now this time, instead of exposing the black, flat black base layer, we're now exposing that initial layer of buff paint we added. So let's do a series of drums here, and we're going to do different colorways. The technique is exactly the same. I've actually got 3 different brands of paint that I'm using. I'm using the Vallejo paints, the Reaper miniature paints, and the AK 3rd generation water-based paints. And the reason I'm using all these different paints is I want to illustrate how important it is for you not to get focused on what's the best paint and all this. They all work great. Whatever's available. Hobby store craft paint works good too. You'll find that they all have a little bit different peeling effects. So let's do, so this drum has a red center, so let's do gray. And you can see I'm going to cycle through. One drum's going to be sitting in the rubbing alcohol jar. The paint will be slowly dissolving away, the fresh paint. The paint that was applied earlier that is dry will not peel away. That's why you want to wait a few hours between layers. You can go overnight. You can go 2 weeks, but just make sure it's thoroughly dry. We don't have to wait for it to be cured. So we apply the gray paint to the top and bottom bands, once again using the pressure of my paintbrush hand to spread the bristles to the width of the band to create a nice, clean, even layer. Pull the previous one out of the jar, and you can see there's already some of the yellow paint is being stripped away just by sitting in the jar. You can get some really cool effects by leaving it in and sloshing it around, but just experiment. I mean, there's no right or wrong way to do this. The whole point is to lay different colors down and different color combinations submerge the casting in rubbing alcohol, and then use the cosmetic wedge sponge. I do want to point out the versatility of this technique. Whether you're working with white metal castings or hand-poured resin or the 3D printed details, the technique works equally the same using the same materials. One thing that's important to keep in mind is in order to get a really nice chipped effect, you do need to create a contrast between that base layer that you primed with the spray paint and the successive layers of the water-based paint. If there's not much of a contrast, and you can see that in some of these examples with the red on top of the black, you will not get the big pop that you see with a lighter color like an ivory or a buff. But what's great about that is you can start with a red base layer, come back and do successive layers on top of it, exposing red and black underneath. Now it's time for the final process, which will be the application of powdered chalk on top of all these wonderful peeled paint layers. All right, now that we've got everything painted, once again, several hours have elapsed. The paint is thoroughly dry. We're going to come back and apply a chalk weathering on top. I've got a couple different brushes that I like to use for the chalk weathering. I use a lot of these chiseled brushes, and then there's just a stub nose brush when you want to get, for streaks of oil and things like that, that brush is good. Got my compartmented hinged box with the different chalk powders in, my single edge razor blade, and just to refresh your memory, if you haven't watched the video, I just take the single edge razor blade and scrape it along the Rembrandt chalk stick to create a very fine powder. Don't overthink this, and don't powder an entire chalk stick at one time. Even if you feel you're not creative, this is a creative process, having all these different chalk powders available to you. And you'll see I'm going to actually brush the brush on top of the chalk stick half the time, as well as dip it in the powder. If you have too much powder, you're going to have too much chalk. So we want to be subtle here. So just literally going to start brushing the chalk on, and you will see this is really where the transformation takes place. It dulls all the colors down, it homogenizes everything. I've done videos on this before, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm selecting the black and the rust-colored chalks at random. There's not a lot of thought that goes into this. I just want to lay some chalk powder on top to dull and homogenize. Now we can add a little bit of a streak, of an oil streak coming down the side. That's really strong, that black streak, and it's very easy to feather that out with some other chalk colors, which is what I'm getting ready to do here. What I want you to do is just keep it random. Don't overthink this. Don't plan it out. Just grab your brush, dip it in, or brush it on top of a piece of chalk, and add your final weathering. The texture of the paint and the 3D printed casting will do a great job of adhering the chalk powder to the part. Because these parts aren't like a locomotive or a piece of rolling stock that's going to be handled a lot, you don't have to worry about fixing the chalk powder to the casting. In fact, if you were to use a fixative like dull coat, you would actually dissolve the chalk powder and remove everything that's amazing about this technique. So here's a killer little Bennett oil highboy, and it was treated the exact same way as the oil drums. And one cool thing about oil highboys is the corners get their ends exposed. The paint rubs off on the corners, and I just swiped my finger up on each of the four corners while I was painting it, making sure not to smear it. And once again, here is the chalk powder being laid down on top of the cosmetic wedge peeled paint, and this is an amazing detail. I mean, look how gorgeous that is. So simple. I mean, it's so simple. A little bit too much chalk, take your finger and smooth it out. The key here is fine chalk powder, not using too much chalk powder, and the paint has to be thoroughly dry. Here are a few examples of 3D printed detail parts that have had this chipped paint effect added. I'm Brett Gallant, SierraWest Scale Models. I really appreciate you watching this video. Please be sure to check out my website and my collection of 3D printed detail parts. It's ever expanding with lots of new things coming. Thanks so much.